I'm from a generation, I can see some other people from this generation here who probably first came across Florence Nightingale in a Ladybird book. I had it was one of the 5 or 6 Ladybird books I had. It had a picture of her with her light on the front cover. And in the Ladybird book, I'm afraid to say there was no reference to statistics. But as the years have gone by, I've become more and more persuaded that it is in kind of statistical context that we should really think about Florence Nightingale, and reading about her, actually reading what she wrote at the time, is pretty extraordinary, and she was a wonderful example of exactly what Charlotte just talked about, the recognition that statistics had power. I'm an unashamed data nerd. I really, really, really love data. I love, I love just the raw numbers, so it's pretty extreme, but I love the raw numbers, I love their presentation, I love their power. And one of the things I feel really passionate about is how often people underestimate quite how pervasive data and number and quantification is. I got here roughly on time because I could tell the time. I could use a watch that told me the time using numbers. The number of rudely, there isn't a waiting list for this lecture, and you have many friends who didn't sign up who should have done, so there could have been a waiting list, and if there'd been a waiting list we would have had to count the number of seats there are in the lecture theatre and work out who could be lucky enough to come. The electricity that is powering the screens relies completely on quantification. We have to know how much we need, where it needs to go, how much capacity we've got. The food, the wonderful food that some of us will be lucky enough to eat tonight, will have been counted, weighed. Its cooking will rely on numbers. Its delivery will certainly rely on numbers. The weather forecast that I looked at this morning to work out whether I needed to have a coat on relied on numbers, on quantification, on measurement. The question of whether or not the world is getting warmer relies on a whole host of quantification and presentation of data. The schools that we all went to relied on quantification to work out where we needed schools, how many teachers we needed, and when we finished schools and got wonderful exam results, which I'm sure almost everybody here did, that relied on all kinds of quantification. Hospital provision relies on quantification. The fact that many of us are alive, not dead, relied on some wonderful work, much of it not done a million miles from here, that demonstrated using statistical methodology that smoking killed you. Everywhere we look, all of the time, we are relying on numbers. And if we deny that, then we get things very, very badly wrong. There is no alternative to quantification. Of course, it's not everything. We can't measure everything that matters, but there's an awful lot that matters where the only thing we can do is measure it. At its best, quantification and statistical thinking presses us to think precisely and to move on. They allow us, and indeed often compel us, to realise when our thinking is unclear and sloppy, and they can help us do much better. We have to think very hard about what it is that we measure. We have to think very hard about why we're measuring it, about how we measure it, and what it might possibly mean. Now, of course, sometimes we'll get these things wrong. And one of the prevailing challenges that I've faced in the last at least 25 years is that it's very easy to make people laugh about when statistics are wrong. It's very easy to tease people when they do things inappropriately. And I fear that too much of the discussion, the popular discussion about statistics, is about misuse of statistics and about when we get it wrong. Now, often that can be terribly revealing, but it creates a culture where repetition of the lies, damn lies and statistics thing happens again and again. And that focus on when things go wrong actually diverts attention from the wonderful uses that we can make of them. So I hope that, although I'm going to do a little bit of talking about some occasions when they go wrong tonight, I hope we can all be part of a movement that sees the power and majesty in quantification and data and statistics, and not just the silly errors. For public policy, for almost every bit of public policy, a clear understanding of the numbers is absolutely essential. If you haven't got a clear understanding of the numbers, you are nowhere. Now, most of the work today is going to be done by me, but you're going to have to do some of it. And we're going to begin with a multiple choice question. And there's a handy board over here, so we'll be able to write your answers down. It's going to be a multiple choice question, and it's really important that everybody answers, and anybody who doesn't answer, that I notice, has to come and stand at the front and sing a hymn of my choosing. So I can't see many people who look as though they'd be great singers, so play the game. It's a very simple question. Imagine that we take the whole population of the United Kingdom and we line them up, starting with the bottom over there and the top over there. We line them up by their net income, so their income after they've received social security benefits and paid taxes. And we're going to normalise it all so as though everybody is part of a childless couple. And that might be an ambition for some of you, it might be a fond memory for others of you. So we normalise income so that the net incomes of childless couples. And we're asking the question, we've lined them up by rank, and then we're going to take the person 10% from the top, so the person at the 90th centile, or the household at that point, and we're going to divide their income, that income, by the income of the household that is 10% from the bottom. So it's the 90-10 income ratio. What's the ratio of the income of the person at the 90th centile to the person at the 10th? And we'll make it very easy. So these are the options. Is the income of the 90th centile 4, 6, 8, 10 or 12 times the income of the 10th centile? So I can't be accused of outrageous framing. We'll start in the middle. So who thinks the answer is 8? 1, 2, yeah. Both slightly tentative. And that demonstrates that psychology is probably even more interesting than statistics. My experience has been that in groups of fewer than 70, nobody will raise their hand for the first option. And that absolutely systematically, the first option has fewer positive responses than any other. Okay, so 2 brave, or perhaps socially awkward people. But no, you're all statisticians. There's nobody socially awkward here. Who thinks the answer is 6? Who thinks the answer is 10? Who thinks the answer is 4? And who thinks the answer is 12? Okay, so most people thought the answer was 10, about 25% thought the answer was 12, 2 thought the answer was 8, 9 thought the answer was 6, and 8 thought the answer was 4, and I will tell you the answer later. Why am I doing that? Well, because most public policy questions rely on a belief, possibly a prejudice, but a belief about what the world looks like. And a very current set of questions in this country and around the world is income inequality. And so you'd expect a group like this, a highly intelligent, well-informed group, to have an answer to a question like that. Well, you did all have an answer. My favourite chart for most of my life is the chart I'm about to show you. It's not my favourite chart anymore, and I will show you my current favourite chart later. This is my favourite chart. So this is a representation of the UK income distribution. So number of individuals up the side, net income in pounds a week along the bottom. So, to get to, and maybe we should change these numbers so they are annual, but anyway, they're pounds a week. So you can see that the median is a little bit less than £500 a week, so a bit less than £25,000 a year. Bottom 10% is £241 a week. Top 10% is £920 a week. If you're interested in public policy, most public policy things that most people care about, if you're interested in, for example, the social security system, the tax system, housing policy, you really ought to understand what this chart looks like. If I had £1 for every time I'd heard a politician talk about Middle Britain, you know, a GP married to a teacher. A GP married to a teacher is, I don't know so what room is next door? Anyway, about halfway into the room next door. Unthinkably wealthy relative to most of the UK. But much public policy discussion is about people in this group, as though there are a lot of them and they're the norm. Half of the households in the United Kingdom have, in equivalised terms, a net income of less than £25,000 a year. So if you're talking about public policy, you better be clear about that. Now, where is all this? I've just stuck this data up as though it's dropped from the sky. We're statisticians, we know data doesn't just drop from the sky. The data that I'm going to show you for the next few minutes is drawn from two surveys, largely a thing called the Family Expenditure Survey and another thing called the Family Resources Survey. These are surveys of households. Between 7,000 and 10,000 households a year, as representative as we can get of the UK population as a whole. I vividly remember a seminar I gave at the number 10 policy unit in the second half of the 1990s. I won't specify exactly where in the second half of the 1990s, because that would tell you which government was in power, and that would be unfair. So I went to the number 10 policy unit, and I was talking about numbers like this. And the question I asked them was not, what's the 90-10 ratio, but what income would you need to be in the top 10% of the UK household income distribution? You can see that at the moment it's between £45,000 and £50,000 a year. Back then it was £25,000. So I said, you know, what income do you need to be in the top 10% of the UK household income distribution? Is it, I think I said 25, 45, 65, 85, 105, £125,000, and everybody who worked at the number 10 policy unit thought the answer was £125,000 or £105,000 when it was £25,000. Now that's quite an important thing if you're running the country. So then I put the numbers up and they told me that the numbers must be wrong, which is one interpretation. So this for many years has been my favourite, because I think you really need to understand this. You need to know where the middle is, where the top and the bottom are, how thin the tail is. When I started doing this kind of work, which was in 1980, it was the 1977 income distribution that we were working on. This is the 1977 Family Expenditure Survey. There were 7,198 households who'd responded in that year. 3 of them were corrupt, or rather the data was corrupt. I expect more than 3 of them were corrupt. And to get this data took an enormous amount of time and effort. I remember working on it in the computing service building at 13 Banbury Road on the ICL 1906. There are probably some people here who remember the ICL 1906. I couldn't work out why there appeared to be a pneumatic drill in the room next door until I realised it wasn't a pneumatic drill, it was a card reader. You know, the program that we wrote to strip this data off was written in COBOL, and the raw data was in hexadecimal format. It was a lot of work. These days it's 5 minutes to produce these kinds of things. Anyway, that was the distribution. Then you'll notice that it's different in shape. At about that time, Tony Atkinson, now very sadly deceased, died at the beginning of this year. A wonderful person, a wonderful economist, said to me that he thought what we really needed to understand what was going on in the distribution of income was a time series of consistent cross-sections like this, so we could see what had happened over time. And colleagues of mine at the IFS over the ensuing years put a great deal of time and effort into it. And so now what I'm about to show you is a time series, an animated time series of the UK income distribution since 1961. So here we are, 61, 62. Not much changes. There's some noise, which is what you'd expect, but the shape doesn't appear to be changing very much. There's not very much thickening of the tails or movement down here. We're now into the 1970s, a period when the UK economy was not working very well. But again, nothing dramatic. There's something of a shift to the right, but not much. Watch what happens in the second half of the 1980s. It's quite extraordinary shift in the second half of the 1980s. Then through the 90s we go back to the pattern of what we'd seen before. There's a steady shift, but nothing very dramatic. Now we're into the 2000s, and again we see steady change, but nothing on anything like the scale that we saw in the second half of the 1980s. Now again, there was a lot of effort involved in doing all of this. The data from the 1960s hadn't been analysed when we went back to it in the early 1990s, and to get to the 1960s we had to go to Sainsbury's because they were the only institution that had a mainframe left on which we could read the tapes. We also had to send a young man called Steve Webb, who in the last Parliament was the Pensions Minister, but at that stage was working with the IFS. We had to send him down to Kew, to the Public Record Office, because quite a lot of the original household questionnaires had not been input properly. Anyway, so it was a lot of work to do all of this, and we ended up having this change. So here is 1963. Between 63 and 73, my clicker is, oh no, here we are. We've gone too far. Between 63 and 2013, you see there's a massive change. The distribution this is all in constant real prices. We could talk later about how you do that, and it's not straightforward. There's a shift to the right, and there's a massive thickening of the tail. When does it happen? Well, it doesn't really happen between 63 and 73. Between 63 and 73 in that decade, there's a little bit of action down here. There's a bit of a shift to the right, but not a huge amount. If we go on another decade, again, a little bit more thickening, but nothing very much. But then look at what happens in the following decade. If the clicker works. Yeah, it does. So from 83 to 93, we see a real transformation in the shape of this distribution. And that, for anything like an economic distribution, that is a remarkable change. From 93 to 2003, again, not much. And from 2003 to 2013, again, not much. So the big change occurs there. I mean, it's an astonishing change. So we've now done what Tony Atkinson had said. We got all of this stuff, and we thought, well, you know, what's the thing we should look at next? What's the story? And one of the things that we noticed was that there seemed to be an awful lot of people with very low incomes. And we were nice people, and so we were naturally very concerned about that. And the number of people with very low incomes had grown dramatically over this period. So one of the first pieces of work that we did was to go away and look in much more detail at who these people were. You know, this is 600,000 people with apparently almost zero income. That seems pretty worrying. When we looked at them, we were a bit puzzled because there were many aspects of their characteristics that didn't seem what we would have expected. And then one of the great things about this data set is it's a thing called the Family Expenditure Survey. It was originally designed to produce the weights for the price indices. So as well as income data, it has consumption data. So we thought, well, why don't we have a look at the consumption of these people? What we discovered is that median expenditure was not related to income in the way that we might have expected. This bit was from people with incomes of £100 a week on. It was relatively closely correlated with what we would expect, that as income rose, so would consumption. But down here we found that as income rose, consumption fell, and that the consumption of people with zero income was, on average, roughly at the same level as the people with median income. And that made us think, well, first of all, we thought, blimey, we've made a terrible mistake somewhere, we've done something wrong. On further inspection, it turned out that we hadn't made a mistake. It's just that the people who had zero income were not like what we thought they were. So it wasn't the case that everybody had zero income because they couldn't get any income. Some of them had zero income because they'd had a very good year the previous year, and so they decided they weren't going to have any income this year. They were going to consume out of the income that they'd earned the previous year. Self-employed people who have quite noisy income. That's a perfectly legitimate. Some of them were students who were living off the fat of their parents. And so although they had very low incomes, they didn't have very low consumption because they were able to consume in other ways. And for us, this was quite chastening because, like most other economists, we thought income was the natural thing to go with. So we'd been measuring income, we'd been looking at the changes in the distribution of income. But what we'd been guilty of, and this is the kind of first lesson for, I hope for today, is that we were looking at income because that was the thing we had a measure of. It was a thing that was easy to get at. But actually income is not what economists really care about, or at least we don't care about snapshots of income. We might be very interested in lifetime income. So income over the whole of somebody's lifetime is probably going to be highly correlated with their economic opportunities. Income in any small time period isn't. And the reason we were looking at it was that was what we got. And what this reminded us was that actually probably what economists, what we tend to be more interested in would be expenditure, although of course expenditure is very lumpy. Expenditure as a proxy for lifetime income, lifetime economic opportunity. So it was for us a reminder that you need to be terribly careful not to get carried away with thinking that because you've got some data that's closely related to what you're interested in, it's actually what you're really, really interested in. So what we discovered when we saw this is that a single period of very low income will not necessarily be correlated with real economic deprivation, and that took us down a line of looking at persistence of low income and discovering that a relatively small proportion of those who are in the bottom of the income distribution in any one year will be in the bottom of the income distribution in the second and subsequent years. And that's the group that we would be really, really concerned about. It made us think much more about dynamics, and I think dynamics is something that in almost all areas we need to think about very hard. So that was one lesson from this piece of work which we loved. Nonetheless, that income distribution material that I show you, I'm convinced tells us much more than something like this. So this is just an aggregate chart that shows you what's happened to the real level of aggregate income in the UK since 1948. It's also surprising. Another multiple choice question I sometimes ask is how much has real national income gone up by since 1948? I asked that of the inaugural conference of the Treasury's economists about a decade ago, and I said, has it since 1948 gone up by 50%, 100%, 150, 200, 250%? At the time, I think the answer was about 316%. Scarily, more than half of the Treasury's economists thought that since 1948, the economy had grown by 50 or 100%. Now, if that was the case, then the annual growth rate was 1% a year or less. And given that it's averaged 2.75%, that's a bit terrifying, isn't it? This chart does have some information. Real GDP is 5 times as high as it was before, but it doesn't tell us very much about how that's been shared out. Now, most of you, I'm sure, will have realised the answer to the 90-10 question because it was implicit in the first chart, but for those who were not paying real attention, this is the 90-10 income ratio since 1961. So through the 1960s and 1970s, and this is one way of measuring inequality, it was 3. It rose in the second half of the 1980s to about 4.5, and since then it's declined. So let's consult your answers. 8 of you were correct. 9 of you were not bad, 2 of you were brave, and most of you were rubbish. Although at one level it's kind of funny, and you didn't do worse than any other group I've tried this with. The editors of the BBC's news programmes, MPs, almost any academic group you can imagine. You gave the same kind of answers as they did. In fact, slightly more of you got the correct answer, but not very many of you. And I bet you've all got a view about inequality, but you've all got a sense about the economy and economic inequality, and without wishing to be rude, most of those views are uninformed because you were very, very badly wrong about the level of income inequality in the UK at the moment. Now, mainly I think you were wrong because if I'd asked you the question about how much income do you need to be in the top 10%, you would massively have exaggerated that. I expect most of the people in this room over the age of 30 are certainly for their cohort in the top 5% of the UK income distribution and don't like to think of themselves like that. And everybody in this room, almost without exception, over their lifetimes will be at the very top of the income distribution. We tend not to think of ourselves as being like that. We tend to think of ourselves as being in every dimension much closer to the mean than we are. So I think of myself as being very slightly shorter than the norm. And actually, I'm stunted. We just don't get these things right. The other really striking thing about this, which again is surprising, and I still find surprising and inconsistent with what I feel to be true, is that on this measure of inequality, which is just one measure of income inequality is constant through the 60s and 70s, rises sharply in the second half of the 1980s, and then actually it's fallen. Since 1991, which is the peak, income inequality measured like this has gone down. And again, that's not the narrative, but it's what the numbers say. So perhaps this is an artifact of the particular way in which we're trying to summarise a complex distribution, using only two moments. And maybe if we... So let's think of all the other ways that we can think of measuring income inequality. A Gini coefficient, the 80-20 ratio, the 90-10 ratio, the Palmer ratio, these are all different ways of measuring inequality. Well, they tell the same story, that in the second half of the 1980s, during that really remarkably rapid change in the shape of the distribution, income inequality rises very quickly, and since then it's fallen. And to make that even clearer, if you just anchor it at 1990, then all of these measures of income inequality have gone down, not up. So, and what's the lesson from that? Well, I think part of the lesson here is it really is a good thing to go and look at the data. Let's not allow public policy to be driven by what we believe to be true. Let's just go and look at the numbers. Now, so if income inequality has been going down, not up, does that mean that people are wrong to be disenchanted? Or does it mean perhaps that income inequality isn't necessarily the thing that tells us the whole story? Well, I suspect it's the latter, not the former. One thing that you might say is, well, all of those measures of income inequality are looking at the inequality of the whole distribution, not some part of it. So let's look at the top 1%. This is the bottom line here is the 90-10 ratio. If you look at the share of the top 1%, interesting, you can see that, so it bobbles around in the same way to the mid-1980s. Then it rises like in inequality in the second half of the 1980s. It goes on rising for a decade more than the inequality of the whole distribution goes on rising. But even then, at the beginning of this century, it stops rising. And if anything, it's been going down a bit recently. Now, of course, measuring the share of income of the top 1%, as we're reminded by the Paradise Papers, is not a straightforward business. So I don't honestly put I don't have enormous confidence in this line, much less confidence in this line than I have in this line. The 90-10 ratio is really quite well established. It's not, but it certainly doesn't look as though we've continued to see a racing away of the top 1%. So we have to recognise some uncertainty there. What other explanations might there be? Well, one is, another possibility is that, again, we're focusing too much on income and we're not paying enough attention to wealth. In a world where people consume all of their income every year, then all we need to worry about is income. Actually, as we've got richer, wealth itself starts to look like something we should be interested in. This just shows you what percentage of individuals either have or expect to receive an inheritance by birth year. So these, so David Cox is here, and I'm sorry, David, we don't have a bar for you, which is quite rude. but my guess is that if we did, the data would come down. As we come forward to the horrible pimply youths, the young people, many more than half of the pimply youths are expecting to receive inheritances. And that's not because their parents are getting more and more generous relative to, it's that their parents and grandparents of the pimply youths have much more wealth than our grandparents did. And so inheritance, which for the population as a whole wasn't a terribly important thing in the early post-war period, is now becoming a more and more significant thing. And that means that just looking at income won't do it for us. And a measure of how quickly that's happening is this chart. So this shows you total wealth, household wealth in the UK as a share of gross domestic income. And you can see that in this period from 1974, which is as far back as I can go, to here. So in this period, real incomes have roughly trebled, and the ratio of wealth, household wealth to those incomes has gone from about 3 to about 8. So in a period when incomes have trebled, on top of that trebling of underlying income, wealth has itself, relative to income, almost trebled. So in the post-war period, we've moved from a world where you could probably just about say, let's only look at income, to a world where you've definitely got to take account of wealth as well if you're going to have a proper understanding of what's happening. What else should we think about as far as this is concerned? Well, one last thing about income. I said quickly, and as a throwaway line earlier on, that we'd normalised all of this to households who were childless couples. That's fine if family units and household units are clearly defined and stable. And I can remember a conversation I had in the very early 1980s with a colleague of mine at the IFS. I worked on the household population, he worked on the company population. And I remember saying to him how glad I was that I did my job rather than his, because he had to worry about subsidiaries and partnerships and foreign owned, whereas I had this nice, neat, stable unit that I could be sure of. Well, let me tell you, it doesn't look like that anymore. As family formation and breakup has become more common, the notion of the stable nuclear family being the easy thing to measure just doesn't work anymore. More and more children have certain forms of membership of more than one family. And just thinking that we can drop everybody into a single family, add them up and do the kinds of things I've been doing here, it just doesn't work anymore. Now, none of this is to say that I don't think all of that data that I've just showed you is anything other than great fun and incredibly enlightening. I think it is. But it is to say that we need to think very, very hard. We need to think again and again hard about what we're measuring, about why we're measuring, about what we're really interested in, about what the units may be, and about what other things we should have as well. Okay, that's enough on income. Right now, because it's the afternoon, we're going to play a little game. So there's a brief game interlude, and I will be testing to see how quickly we can circulate the dice that I got in this pot around this group. And I have comparative data for a group at the University of Nottingham a couple of weeks ago, the quantitative economics course in PPE. A number of other, the bishops of the Church of England. They were quite fast, actually. Perhaps lots of gambling. So take one die and pass it on, and pass it round. And what we're going to do is, in this little game, we're just going to see whether or not these things work. So this is a very sophisticated data production process that we're going to go through. I want to get the dice round as quickly as possible. You're not doing very well at the moment, guys. The economists are doing better than you. And what I want everybody, there won't be enough dice to go round, because I'm afraid there is an attrition process with my top pot of dice, and I top up the pot of dice normally in January each year, and it hasn't been topped up for a while, so I'm running out of dice. What I want all of you to, with dice to do is I want you to imagine the bit of road outside where you live. And we're going to use the dice to to create the data which tells us how many accidents occur on that bit of road. So have all the dice gone round? Yeah. Still going. This is not good for statistics as a profession. You know, you haven't got fast hands. Once they've all been circulated, what I want all of you who have dice to do is roll your dice twice. So we're going to do that to identify the accident black spots. And while you're doing it, I'm going to make some speed cameras because this is an important part of the process. Okay, just twice. Feels to me as though there's an awful lot of multiple, incontinent dice rolling. And anybody who's rolled their dice more than twice is disqualified. We don't want any of that. So I imagine that we should, with a group this size, I think I'll need probably about 6 speed cameras. Okay, so how many 12s did we get? Anybody get 12? No 12s. How many 11s? Raise your hand if you've got 11. 1, 2, 3, 4 11s. Okay, so we've got 44 accidents in the accident black spots, and what I've got some very sophisticated speed cameras here, which I'm going to give out to the accident black spots. So raise your hand again if you had 11. There's one over here. Very good. This does need to be taken very seriously, I should stress. And so once we've handed the cameras out, what I want the people who are the accident black spots to do is hold the camera in one hand, and with their other hand, with the camera facing the dice, roll the dice twice more, and we'll see whether it works. Okay, so go for it. Okay, so starting over here. 7. 5. 8. And 5. Okay, so we've gone from 44 to 7, 12, 20, 25. That's quite a good, so the cameras worked quite effectively. Now, you might well say to me, well, that's really stupid. And I have to say, I'd be with you. Surely nobody would investigate the effectiveness of speed cameras in this way. In 2004, the Department of Transport published some work that had been done by a very reputable group at a reputable university. And what they'd done is they'd looked at places where there were an above average number of accidents, and they put speed cameras in those places, and then they'd looked to see what happened to the number of accidents. I was making the radio program that Charlotte mentioned at the time, and we went to see them and we said, regression to the mean? Might it be possible that chance had played a part in the distribution of accidents? Oh, no, certainly not. Absolutely not. 2 years later, I think it was 3 years later, the Department of Transport published again. And of the decline in accidents they had previously claimed was caused by speed cameras, they said, well, actually 18% of it is a long-run secular decline. 60% of it is regression to the mean. So only slightly more than 20% of the number we first thought of is an accurate number. But of course, any reduction in deaths is a good thing. Well, of course, any reduction in deaths is a good thing, but this is public policy we're talking about. And these things, I say I'm a very keen cyclist. I'm all for people not driving too fast. But these things are not free. And if they're only 1/5 as effective as we thought that they were, then the allocation of resources to these as opposed to fences outside primary school gates or driver re-education or better lighting or changing the shape of junctions will be wrong. Now, I use this example partly because it's the middle of a lecture, it's good to break for a moment, but partly because regression to the mean is an example of a rather simple bit of statistical thinking, but a simple bit of statistical thinking that is ignored by almost the whole policy-making profession. Again and again, you will see people claiming that when something goes down or up, if it's gone in the direction they wanted, this is a demonstration that they've had an effect. Chancellors of the Exchequer are particularly guilty of this. But so are people responsible for health. After the ban on smoking, in Scotland in particular, I think, there was a claim that this had led to a reduction in the number of admissions for myocardial infarction. Well, it is true that after the ban on smoking, the number of admissions declined. It then rose again. Both the decline and the rise were broadly within the parameters for the degree of variance that we saw in most years. As a group of statisticians, we should have the courage and the inclination to tell people when they're talking absolute garbage, and playing with dice isn't a bad way of reminding them of that. Let me move on to another example of how I think we need to think. Something that Charlotte mentioned that I did 6-7 years ago was I was asked by the government to think about how we should fund care for older people. 4 years after that, legislation received the royal assent based on the recommendations we made. Now, I always thought that once you got royal assent for a piece of legislation, then it happened. 6 weeks after the 2015 general election, I discovered that that was not true, and now these recommendations are on hold. But that's not really what I want to talk to you about is how we thought about it and why statistics helped. So, in this country, if you fall ill and have a really serious illness, then the state pays. I mean, you could choose to pay for yourself, you could choose to go privately, but actually if you're ill, then the state will pay for you. If, on the other hand, you acquire dementia or arthritis so severe that you can't look after yourself, the state doesn't pay for you. It will pay for your medical treatment, it won't pay for you to be looked after. We have a means-tested regime that means that if you have no resources of your own, the state will look after you, but other than that, you're on your own. And this causes a great deal of concern and political upset. But the thing that puzzled me when I was asked to look into what we should do about it was I wasn't initially sure what the problem was. After all, we don't expect the state to intervene to pay for housing unless you have low income or food or holidays or anything else. Mostly we leave people to get on with it. But it was clear to us there was a problem. There was something to be done here. We were struggling to nail it down. And we went on struggling to nail it down until the wonderful analytical colleagues I had were able to provide me with a chart that I'd asked for. And the chart I'd asked for was essentially the probability distribution of social care need. And this is what this is. So imagine we lined 100 65-year-olds up in order of how much social care they were going to need before they would die. And you can see that about 20% of them won't ever need any social care. So these are the lucky ones, or unlucky, depending on how you look at it, who are out for a walk on their 98th birthday in full possession of all of their physical and mental faculties, and then wallop, they die. Have a heart attack, that's it, no need for social care. And roughly a fifth of us, that will be the case. The median is not very high. So the median need for social care before death is only about £20,000. This is all in 2010 prices. But what's interesting about this chart is its shape. And so this rises off to infinity. And actually, it does practically rise to infinity. Imagine that there are two of you, you're a couple, and you both end up needing 20 years of, excuse me while I do up my shoelace, you both end up needing 20 years of residential care. Well, that residential care could easily cost you £35,000 each a year, so £70,000 between the two of you, and for 20 years we're talking about the best part of £1.5 million, which is quite a lot in anybody's money. You can see that we struggled to create this data, and some of it doesn't look all that smooth. That's because the data didn't exist. We didn't have longitudinal data. What we had was snapshots of how much was being consumed in any 1 year, so we had to do some modelling to produce this distribution. Why is it important? Well, because it's an unusual shape, and it's a shape that is characteristic of certain things like, so the consequences of having of serious health problems look like this. Some people will never have any health problems, most will have a little bit, and then some people will have something very expensive, or the consequence of your house burning down. Most of us, our house will never burn down, a few of us will have a little fire, and some of us will lose the lot. Or the possibility of a car accident. So There's a group of largely women who never have a car accident. Then there's most of us, and there's a group of people of both genders who've been driven into by young men who have a serious... that's an unkindly gender-loaded statement. So what this shape is characteristic of is things where we want to pool risk. So there's a whole host of things in our lives where there's a relatively small probability of something really nasty. And faced by that, what we typically want all say is, well, I don't want that possibility of the nasty thing. I don't want to save up enough money in case I have this. I'd much rather pay an insurance premium, which means that if I turn out to be one of the lucky ones, I've spent money that perhaps I didn't need to, but that's given me the assurance that I don't face the bad risk. Now, almost all of the things that exist that have this shape, the risk is pooled. So the NHS pools our healthcare risk. It's illegal not to take out insurance for your car. It's not illegal not to insure your house, but almost everybody does. There's one big risk that we all face where there's no risk pooling at the moment, and that's social care. So why is that? There are lots of risks that the state doesn't take on. The state does take on the healthcare risk, but it doesn't take on the fire risk or the car risk. Why doesn't the private sector deal with this? Well, the reason the private sector doesn't deal with this is that there's what we might technically call the aggregate shock risk. The private sector, if we knew this was what the shape of this curve was going to be in 40 years' time, then insurance companies would be flocking to write this kind of business. But it could easily be 40 years' time that we need to know this. I'm now, so full revelation, I'm 57. My grandmother died 3 or 4 years ago at the age of 104 and a half, and she needed this for the last year and a half of her life. So I've got nearly 50 years left, but I'd quite like to get rid of this risk now. The problem is that while we know that's the shape, or we knew that was the shape in 2010, could easily be the shape in 10 years' time is this. That there is an aggregate shock that increases the costs that everybody is likely to face, or it could even be like this. And if that's the case and you're the poor private insurance company that has sold the business, then you basically go bust. No two ways about it. That means that nowhere is there any pre-funded insurance available for this. In this country, you can buy a thing called an immediate needs annuity. So at the point where you go into residential care, you're offered the chance to share your risk with everybody else going to residential care at the same time. That's better than nothing, but it would like the car market equivalent would be that when and only when you have a car crash, you're offered the chance to share your risk with everybody else who has a car crash at the same time, which is better than nothing because some people will just bash in their front wing and some people will die, but it's not the same as pooling the risk across the whole population. The other thing that's available in the US is that you can buy something that insures the bottom half of the risk. So it will say, well, we'll provide you with cover for 3 years or $300,000, and then it runs out. Well, that seems to be precisely what you don't want. What you're worried about is the catastrophic risk, not the... Now, it's margin. So what was our recommendation? Well, once we had this data, which represented what was going on, then it was very easy to see what should happen. And that is that if the state's not going to pool all of the risk, but in a world where the private sector will not, the state should pool the catastrophic bit of the risk. And if the state pulls the catastrophic bit of the risk, then we can cope with the rest. That was what our recommendation was, that there should be a cap set on the amount that any individual was liable for, and the state would pull the risk beyond there. Now, it's not the particular... The point I'm trying to make here is not that that's what we should do, although we discovered just after we'd made our recommendation, there's an extremely elegant article in the 1963 American Economic Review by Ken Arrow, which demonstrates analytically that if you're going to insure less than the whole of the risk, you should insure the catastrophic bit. The point is that a public policy question that people, I think, were very confused about became, at least in my view, massively clearer once we had data that showed us the answer to what things look like now. Now, something else that's important is this, and this may seem like an old fuddy-duddy, fogey, stupid old thing to say, but it is actually really important. Here is this is the Daily Telegraph, but I could have picked any of the big newspapers. This was a story from June 2010. The Office for Budget Responsibility had published some work on the costs of public sector pensions, and they'd shown that they expected public sector pensions to be costing £9.5 billion a year. And the Daily Telegraph had tried to do a really good thing, which is take a number, £9.5 billion, that doesn't really mean anything to most people, and honestly doesn't mean much to me, and I expect it means almost nothing to most of us here, and make it capable of being related to individuals' lives. They said, well, we'll express it per... Now, that looks as though they're expressing it per person, but that would have meant dividing the £9.5 billion by 60 million. So they thought, well, is there a smaller thing that we could divide it by to make it seem bigger? And so they express it per household, of which there are only 25 million. It's an interesting description of you, but anyway. So they said, we'll express it per household, it's £4,000 a year per household. Well, that's a really good thing to do, but it's quite important to do the sum correctly. If there'd been a stray apostrophe in this article, then one of the at least 3 people who read this on behalf of the Daily Telegraph before it was published would definitely have corrected it. If there'd been a split infinitive in the article, there would have been a lengthy disquisition about whether split infinitives were or were not acceptable. These people divided 9.5 billion by 25 million and got this answer. Now, it's not easy to divide 9.5 billion by 25 million in your head. You have to say, well, that's something like 9,000 divided by about 25. So that's something like 900 divided by 2.5. So that doesn't sound like 4,000. They were wrong by an order of magnitude. Okay? So they simply got the sum wrong by a factor of 10. And this kind of thing happens again and again. And it's not a matter of, of course it's funny, but it's not funny. This is a huge national institution. Everything in which is checked again and again. They will have checked the 9 billion and the 25 million. Somebody will have checked those. Just nobody will have checked the sum. But the sum is what does all of the work, and it's got wrong. And this kind of thing does happen again and again. Sometimes it's a wrong sum. Sometimes it's just that the number is meaningless. I remember vividly, I won't identify the person, but a Secretary of State for Education went on the Today programme and said, we really care about instrumental music lessons. It's really important for children in our state schools to be able to have lessons in musical instruments. And because of that, we're allocating an extra £12 million a year to this. There was no discussion of whether that was an appropriate sum. Well, roughly how many children do we think there are in primary school? Well, there are close to 70 million people in the country, and we can imagine that people would live for 70 years. Just rule of thumb. So there are going to be 1 million per year. So that means there are going to be roughly 5 million primary school children. So £12 million means there's £2.40 a year, roughly, for each primary school child. A music lesson costs £24 for 30 minutes. So this sum of money was going to allow 3 minutes per year of tuition for kids in primary schools. Now, what's wrong is not that the politician said it, but that the journalist didn't say, hang on a minute, that doesn't sound like enough to make a difference. Instead, they had a conversation about how the system would run, not that something unbelievably stupid had just been said. We kind of stand for arithmetic. It's a very small part of what we do, but it's an incredibly important part of the public policy debate. We have to understand scales and relativities, and if we don't, we get things badly wrong. Now, I've been going off too long, so I'm not going to talk about administrative data now, although if it comes up in questions, I'm very happy to. Actually, I can't resist this. This is very exciting work that can, I think, supplement censuses in the decade between censuses. Census is a great thing, but we need to know what's going on in the country more than once every 10 years. And now there's so much administrative data available, it really does look as though it's possible for us to mimic the census using administrative data. This is how close you can get to the actual census numbers using 2 data sets, the NHS Population Register and the Department for Work and Pensions Customer Information System. If you add a third, though, And this is the colour for close, and you see that with just 2 data sets, we're not that close. If you add a third, the third we added here was the student record data, then you get really, really close. And we're getting better at the ONS, getting better and better at this all the time. There's some great work released earlier this week using mobile phone data to look at internal migration stuff. You know, there's a wonderful data available. The thing I really want to say about this, though, is that so these are the successful ones. Who but a bunch of statisticians would use grey as the colour of success? I'm just saying. One last set of things I want to talk about. Presentation really, really, really matters. Put your hand up when you've worked out what's dodgy about this graph. It's from a Treasury document. Focus on the y-axis. And for those of you who can't, this number is 1, 10, 100, 1,000, 10,000, 100,000. So it's a nice little log scale. And what's here? Spending, infrastructure spending in different areas. Communications, energy, flood, intellectual capital, transport, waste, and water. Now, would it be cynical to note that this chart was released in a Treasury document shortly after there'd been quite a lot of rain, and some concern about whether we were spending enough on flood defences? Now, it may be that the people in this room, who may be even more nerdy than I am, are able to read this chart with a log axis and work out the relative size of flood and intellectual capital spending, or more importantly, the relative size of flood and energy spending. I don't find this chart terribly easy to read. I find this one easier. Funnily, I mean, there is some spending on flood infrastructure, which a short person like me can just about get down to. I mean, how on earth could that be felt to be an appropriate representation of that data? I mean, you know, I think it was scant, and this happened while I was chairman of the Stats Authority, and I wrote a letter about it because it seemed to me it just wasn't, you know, it's really not good enough. And this is happening everywhere, and it's something that we're not always as good as we ought to be at either. And as the kind of custodians of the use of statistical data, we have to think very hard about whether, when we're writing our papers, we're really presenting the information in a way that makes it tell its story or tell our story. One last thing. I began by meanly teasing you about whether your perception of the world was accurate, and showing, not in a way that is unusual that it wasn't, but in an area where you'd really hope you knew what was going on, actually your perceptions were not as you'd expect. And my own experience is that I'm in that position again and again. I'm again and again confronted with data that demonstrates that my prejudice is wrong. We really need to be alert to that. This is some work done by a man called Roger Harrabin, who is now the BBC's environment editor or correspondent, but at the time he did this was their health correspondent. And this is how many deaths it took from different causes before you got a story in the newspapers. And the newspapers in question are the Guardian and the Daily Mail. So it's both sides of the... So you needed nearly 4,500 deaths from smoking before there was a story about it in the newspapers, 846 from alcohol, 2,500 from obesity, 0.375 of a death from measles, 1.5 from human variant CJD, 22.5 from HIV, and 1,375 from mental health. If the media was holding up a mirror, then those bars would all be the same height. They're not even, I mean, it's not that they're not roughly the same height. They're just not, you know, they are not comparable. So you know, here we're talking about what, a multiple of about 12,000. You need 12,000 times as many deaths from measles as from smoking to get a story. The representation of the world that we consume all of the time is staggeringly inaccurate, and yet that forms the views that then form our views about public policy, and I'm afraid form the views of many politicians about public policy. So looking at the degree of distortion, I'm aware distortion is a normative word to use about, is important for us to recognise that actually if our understanding of the world is to be accurate and if we are to be able to contribute helpfully to public policy, we have to take responsibility for going and finding out what the data really is, even before we start doing the exciting work of trying to understand in more detail what it means. So, in sum, what do I want to say? Well, be bold. Let's not feel sheepish about being people who love numbers. If I hear again somebody say that they don't do numbers, I will be tempted to scream and scream until I'm sick. It is socially unacceptable. It would be, imagine any of us saying we didn't read much. That would be felt to be a very bad thing. Not engaging with numbers is at least that bad. And it's much more difficult not to engage with numbers than it is not to read literature, for example. We engage with numbers automatically all of the time. We should be bold about their significance. We need to think very hard about what we're doing. We need to think about how and what we're measuring. We need to recognise that almost everything that we do will be wrong, but it will be much less wrong than not doing it would be. And we all need to take responsibility for knowing stuff. I'm constantly embarrassed by how wrong I am about how many things. And it's not difficult anymore to get hold of data, to find stuff out. And I'd love us to be in a world where more people thought it was really cool to know the kinds of things that Florence Nightingale put an enormous amount of effort into finding out, when the effort required for us is often just a few clicks away. So let's celebrate what she did. Let's recognise how much easier it is for us than it was for her, and let's just try to do a teeny little bit better. Thank you very much.